Darius Clay's hands were still shaking from the adrenaline when his phone started buzzing incessantly. The smell of smoke clung to his scrubs, and the image of flames licking at twisted metal remained burned into his retinas. He had no idea that the 16-year-old girl he'd just pulled from that inferno was about to change his life forever. What he didn't know was that her father owned 3 major television networks, and by morning, his face would be plastered across every news channel in America. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The evening had started like any other Tuesday for Darius. After pulling a double shift at Metropolitan General Hospital, he was finally heading home to his modest apartment in Queens. His 2012 Honda Civic hummed along the highway as he mentally calculated how many more shifts he'd need to cover his mother's physical therapy bills. At 32, Darius had been a registered nurse for 8 years, working his way through night school while caring for patients who often reminded him of his own family's struggles. The radio played softly in the background, some forgettable pop song that did little to keep his tired mind alert. His eyes burned from the fluorescent hospital lights, and his feet ached in the comfortable but worn sneakers he'd had for 3 years. The familiar weight of exhaustion pressed down on his shoulders as he navigated the moderate evening traffic on Interstate 495. That's when he saw the smoke. At first, it was just a dark smudge against the dusky sky, barely visible beyond the overpass ahead. But as he crested the hill, the scene unfolded before him like something from a nightmare. A sleek black Mercedes had somehow flipped and skidded off the road, coming to rest against a concrete barrier. The front end was completely crumpled, and orange flames were already beginning to lick at the hood. Other cars had pulled over, but their occupants remained a safe distance away, talking rapidly into their phones or simply standing and staring. Darius could see the hesitation in their body language, the natural human instinct to help warring with the equally natural instinct for self-preservation. Without conscious thought, Darius yanked his steering wheel to the right and pulled onto the shoulder. His car had barely stopped moving when he was out the door, running toward the wreckage. His 8 years of medical training had taught him to compartmentalize fear, to push past the initial shock and focus on what needed to be done. "Is anyone in there?" he shouted to the small crowd of onlookers. "Yeah, there's a girl," called back a middle-aged man in a business suit, his face pale with shock. "She's not moving. The door's stuck, and the fire's getting worse." Darius reached the car and immediately dropped to his knees beside the driver's side window. Through the spiderweb of cracked glass, he could see her. She looked to be about 16 or 17, with long dark hair that had fallen across her face. Blood trickled from a cut on her forehead, and her eyes were closed. She was slumped against the steering wheel, unconscious but breathing. The heat from the growing flames was already intense, and Darius knew they had minutes at most before the fire reached the passenger compartment. He tried the door handle, but the impact had bent the frame so severely that it wouldn't budge. "The fire department's on the way," someone called from behind him. "Maybe we should wait." "She doesn't have that long," Darius replied, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He looked around frantically and spotted a tire iron that had been thrown clear of the vehicle during the crash. Using the tire iron as a lever, he managed to create enough space in the doorframe to get his hands inside. The metal was already hot to the touch, and he could feel the heat intensifying by the second. His fingers found the door handle from the inside, and with a combination of pulling and prying, he managed to wrench it open far enough to squeeze through. The smell inside the car was overwhelming. A mixture of gasoline, hot metal, and something else he couldn't identify. The girl, who he would later learn was named Aria Castellanos, was wearing a expensive-looking school uniform that was now torn and stained with blood. Her breathing was shallow but steady, which gave him hope. "Can you hear me?" he asked, gently touching her shoulder. There was no response. He quickly checked her pulse, which was rapid but strong, and ran his hands along her neck and spine, checking for obvious signs of injury. His medical training kicked in fully now, overriding the fear and urgency. The flames were getting closer, and he could hear the crackle and pop of burning plastic and rubber. Smoke was beginning to fill the car's interior, making it hard to breathe. He knew he had to move her, despite the risk of spinal injury. The alternative was certain death. Carefully, he slid his arms under her shoulders and knees, lifting her as gently as possible while still moving quickly. She was lighter than he'd expected, and her head lolled against his chest as he maneuvered them both through the narrow space between the bent door and the car frame. The heat was incredible now, and he could feel it singeing the hair on his arms. 20 feet from the car, 30, 40. Finally, when he felt they were at a safe distance, he carefully lowered her to the ground and immediately began a more thorough assessment. Her eyes fluttered open just as the fire reached the car's gas tank. The explosion lit up the evening sky, and the wave of heat washed over them even from their safe distance. Aria blinked slowly, confusion clouding her dark eyes as she tried to focus on his face. "What happened?" she whispered, her voice hoarse from the smoke. "You were in an accident," Darius said gently, his hands steady as he continued his examination. "You're going to be okay. The ambulance is almost here." Indeed, the wail of sirens was growing closer, and within minutes the area was flooded with emergency responders. Paramedics took over Aria's care, while firefighters worked to extinguish the burning remains of her car. A police officer approached Darius, notebook in hand. "That was incredibly brave," the officer said. "What's your name?" "Darius Clay. I'm a nurse at Metro General." "Well, Mr. Clay, you probably saved that girl's life. The fire investigator says that car would have been completely engulfed within another minute or less." 2. As they loaded Aria into the ambulance, she managed to catch Darius's eye. "Thank you," she mouthed, her hand reaching toward him. He squeezed it gently. "Just doing what anyone would do," he replied, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. The police took his statement and contact information, routine procedure for any accident witness. Darius gave them his address and phone number, answered their questions about what he'd observed, and signed the necessary paperwork. It all felt surreal after the intensity of the rescue, like filling out forms after running a marathon. By the time he finally got back to his car, it was nearly 10 o'clock. His adrenaline was fading, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion that went beyond his already tired state. His hands were shaking slightly as he started the engine, and he noticed for the first time that his scrubs were torn and stained with soot and blood. The drive home passed in a blur. His mind kept replaying the rescue, analyzing his actions, wondering if he could have done anything differently or faster. It was a habit from his medical training, this constant second-guessing and evaluation. Had he checked thoroughly enough for spinal injuries? Had he moved her correctly? The questions circled in his mind like vultures. His apartment building was a modest 3-story walk-up in a working-class neighborhood of Queens. The hallway smelled faintly of cooking spices and cleaning products, familiar scents that usually felt comforting but tonight seemed oddly distant. He climbed the 2 flights of stairs to his unit, his legs feeling heavier with each step. Inside, his 1-bedroom apartment was exactly as he'd left it that morning. A bowl of cereal sat in the sink from breakfast, and his medical journals were stacked on the small dining table where he'd been reading them the night before. The normalcy of it all felt strange after what he'd just experienced. He showered, watching the soot and grime swirl down the drain, and fell into bed around midnight. Despite his exhaustion, sleep was elusive. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw flames and heard the sound of twisting metal. He found himself wondering about Aria, hoping she was okay, that there hadn't been any internal injuries he'd missed. When his phone started ringing at 6 in the morning, his first thought was that it was the hospital calling him in for an emergency shift. It had happened before, and he always said yes, partly because he needed the money, and partly because he genuinely loved his work. But the caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize. "Hello?" His voice was still thick with sleep. "Is this Darius Clay?" The voice was crisp, professional, unfamiliar. "Yes, who's this?" "My name is Rebecca Chen. I'm a producer with Channel 7 News. I understand you rescued a teenager from a burning car last night?" Darius sat up in bed, suddenly wide awake. "I'm sorry, what?" "The accident on I-495. You saved Aria Castellanos. We'd like to interview you for our morning show." "I don't understand. How did you get my number?" "Mr. Clay. Mr. Clay." Do you know who Aria's father is? No, should I? There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Ricardo Castellanos owns Castellanos Media Group. They own 3 television networks, 2 major newspapers, and about a dozen radio stations. The story of his daughter's rescue is going to be everywhere today, and he specifically asked us to find the hero who saved her. Darius felt like the world was tilting on its axis. I'm not a hero. I just did what anyone would have done. Mr. Clay, with all due respect, there were at least a dozen people at that accident scene, and you were the only one who went into that burning car. That makes you a hero in my book. Before he could respond, his phone started buzzing with another incoming call. And another. Within minutes, his phone was ringing almost constantly. Producers, reporters, bookers, for talk shows, all wanting to speak with him about the rescue. He turned on his television and flipped to the news, where his own face stared back at him from the screen. It was his driver's license photo, the one where he looked tired and slightly annoyed. The banner beneath read, "Hero Nurse Saves Media Heiress from Burning Car." The reporter, standing in front of Metropolitan General Hospital, was speaking into the camera with the kind of earnest intensity reserved for breaking news. 32-year-old Darius Clay, a registered nurse here at Metro General, risked his own life last night to save 17-year-old Aria Castellanos from a burning vehicle. Castellanos, the daughter of media magnate Ricardo Castellanos, was trapped inside her car after it flipped and caught fire on Interstate 495. End quote. They cut to shaky cell phone footage that someone had apparently taken of the rescue. Darius watched himself pull Aria from the wreckage just seconds before the car exploded in a ball of flame. Seeing it from this perspective, he was struck by how close they'd actually come to disaster. His phone rang again. This time, the caller ID showed his supervisor at the hospital. Darius? It was Janet Rodriguez, the charge nurse for his unit. Are you seeing the news? I'm watching it right now. I can't believe this. The hospital switchboard has been lighting up all morning. Reporters wanting to know about you. People wanting to donate money to you. Marriage proposals. Serious marriage proposals. The administration wants to meet with you this afternoon. Marriage proposals? Darius felt like he was living in some kind of bizarre dream. You're famous, Darius. Like, really famous. I just saw you on 3 different channels. After he hung up with Janet, Darius made himself some coffee and tried to process what was happening. He'd always been a private person, someone who preferred to stay in the background and do his job without fanfare. The idea of being in the spotlight, of having strangers know his name and face, was deeply unsettling. But as he watched more of the news coverage, he began to understand the magnitude of what had occurred. Aria Castellanos wasn't just any teenager. She was the daughter of one of the most powerful media executives in the country, a man whose companies shaped public opinion and influenced millions of viewers every day. The story was perfect for television. A humble nurse, working double shifts to pay for his mother's medical bills, risks his life to save the daughter of a billionaire. It had all the elements of a Hollywood script: heroism, class differences, danger, and redemption. By noon, there were news vans parked outside his apartment building. Reporters with microphones and cameras lingered in the lobby, waiting for him to emerge. His neighbors, people he'd lived near for 5 years but barely knew, were suddenly experts on his character, giving interviews about what a quiet, helpful young man he was. Mrs. Patterson from 2B, whom he'd helped carry groceries exactly twice, told Channel 4 that she'd always known he was special, and that it didn't surprise her one bit that he'd risk his life for someone else. Mr. Kowalski from across the hall mentioned the time Darius had jump-started his car, apparently evidence of his heroic nature. His phone hadn't stopped ringing. Producers from talk shows, documentary filmmakers, literary agents wanting to help him write a book about his experience. A representative from a major athletic wear company called, asking if he'd be interested in an endorsement deal. Someone from Hollywood wanted to know if he'd sold the movie rights to his story yet. The attention was overwhelming, and Darius found himself longing for the quiet routine of his normal life. He'd always defined himself by his work, by the patients he helped, and the difference he made in small, everyday ways. This sudden fame felt foreign and uncomfortable, like wearing clothes that didn't fit properly. Around 3 o'clock, his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize, but something made him answer it. "Mr. Clay? This is Ricardo Castellanos." The voice was deep, cultured, with just a hint of an accent that spoke of expensive education and international travel. Darius felt his pulse quicken. "Mr. Castellanos, how is Aria? Is she okay?" "She's going to be fine, thanks to you. Some bruised ribs, a mild concussion, a few stitches on her forehead. The doctors say if you hadn't gotten her out when you did." "What?" His voice trailed off. "I'm just glad she's all right. Mr. Clay, I'd like to meet you. I know you've been inundated with media requests today, and I apologize for that. When word got out about what you did for my daughter, well, the story took on a life of its own." "It's been a bit overwhelming," Darius admitted. "I imagine it has. I'd like to invite you to dinner tomorrow evening, if you're available. Just you, May, my wife, and Aria. No cameras, no reporters. I want to thank you properly, and Aria wants to thank you in person." Darius found himself agreeing, though part of him wondered if this was wise. He'd never moved in circles like this, never had dinner with billionaires in what were probably mansions. But the genuine gratitude in Ricardo's voice was unmistakable, and he found himself curious about Aria, wondering how she was processing her own brush with death. The next evening, a black sedan arrived to pick him up. The driver was polite and professional, and the car was more luxurious than anything Darius had ever been inside. Soft leather seats, a bar stocked with expensive-looking bottles, windows so dark he could barely see out. The Castellanos estate was in the Hamptons, a sprawling property that seemed to go on forever behind high walls and electronic gates. The house itself was elegant, but not ostentatious, designed with clean lines and large windows that looked out over perfectly manicured gardens. Ricardo Castellanos was waiting for him at the front door, and he was not what Darius had expected. Instead of the imposing media mogul he'd imagined, he found a man of medium height, with kind eyes and graying hair, wearing a simple button-down shirt and slacks. He could have been anyone's father. "Darius," he said, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming. I'm Ricardo." His wife, Elena, was a petite woman with warm brown eyes and an immediate smile. She hugged Darius as if he were family, which surprised him. "I can't thank you enough," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "When we got the call about the accident, when they said the car was on fire—" She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Aria appeared at the top of the staircase, moving carefully but under her own power. She had a bandage on her forehead, and moved with the cautious gait of someone with bruised ribs, but she was smiling. In jeans and a simple sweater, with her hair pulled back in a ponytail, she looked like any teenager rather than the daughter of one of the most powerful families in America. "Hi," she said shyly as she reached the bottom of the stairs. "I'm Aria. I hear I owe you my life." "You don't owe me anything," Darius replied. "I'm just glad you're okay." Dinner was served in a cozy dining room, rather than the grand formal space Darius had expected. The conversation was easy and natural, ranging from Aria's recovery to Darius's work at the hospital. He found himself relaxing despite the surreal nature of the situation. "I have to ask," Ricardo said during dessert, "what made you decide to become a nurse?" Darius thought about the question. It wasn't one he was asked often, and certainly not by someone whose opinion might actually matter in some larger sense. "My mother had a heart attack when I was 22, he said finally. "She was in the ICU for 2 weeks, and I practically lived there. I watched the nurses, saw how they cared for her, how they made her feel safe and comfortable, even when she was scared. They saved her life as much as the doctors did, just in a different way. I realized I wanted to be part of that." "And your mother now?" Elena asked gently. "She's doing well. She had a stroke 2 years ago, so she needs some physical therapy, but she's tough. She raised 3 kids on her own, worked 2 jobs, most of my childhood. If anyone can handle a little physical therapy, it's her." "That's where the medical bills come from," Aria said suddenly. "The news said you worked double shifts to pay for medical bills." Darius nodded. Insurance doesn't cover everything, but it's worth it. She's my mom. The simplicity of the statement seemed to resonate with something in Ricardo's expression. Here was a man who understood family obligations and the lengths people would go to for the people they loved. After dinner, Ricardo asked if they could speak privately. They walked out onto a terrace that overlooked the gardens, the evening air cool and fragrant with the scent of late-blooming flowers. Darius, I want to do something for you, Ricardo began. I know you've said you were just doing what anyone would do, but that's not true. There were other people there that night, and none of them acted. You did. I don't need anything, Mr. Castellanos. Please, call me Ricardo, and I understand you don't need anything, but I want to help. Your mother's medical bills, for instance. Darius felt a flush of embarrassment. That's very generous, but I can't accept that. It's too much. It's nothing to me, Ricardo said simply. What you did for my daughter, there's no way to repay that. But I can make sure you don't have to work yourself to exhaustion just to take care of your family. They talked for another hour, and gradually, Darius began to understand that this wasn't about charity or pity. It was about one father recognizing another person's devotion to family and wanting to honor that. Ricardo shared stories about his own upbringing, the son of immigrants who had worked multiple jobs to build the foundation of what would eventually become a media empire. My father used to say that character isn't what you do when people are watching, Ricardo said. It's what you do when no one is watching, when there's no reward except knowing you did the right thing. In the end, Darius agreed to let Ricardo pay off his mother's medical debt, but only as a loan. They would work out terms later, something that would allow Darius to maintain his dignity while accepting the help his pride had always prevented him from seeking. When the evening ended and the sedan arrived to take him home, Aria walked him to the car. Can I ask you something? She said. Of course. Were you scared when you were pulling me out of the car? Darius considered the question honestly. Terrified, he admitted. But sometimes being scared is less important than doing what needs to be done. She nodded thoughtfully. I want to be a doctor, she said suddenly. I've been thinking about it since the accident. I want to help people the way you helped me. That's a good goal, Darius said. But make sure you're doing it for the right reasons. Medicine is hard work, and it's not always as dramatic as what happened the other night. Most of the time, it's small things. Holding someone's hand when they're scared, explaining a procedure so they understand what's happening, being there when families get difficult news. That's the real work. I think I'd like that too, she said. The media attention continued for several more days, but it gradually died down as other stories claimed the spotlight. Darius returned to his normal shifts at the hospital, though he noticed his colleagues treating him with a new kind of respect, not because he was famous, but because they'd seen him in action under the most extreme circumstances and watched him handle the aftermath with grace and humility. 3 months later, he received a letter from Aria. She'd been accepted to a pre-med program at Columbia and wanted to thank him again for inspiring her choice of career. She included a photo from her high school graduation, where she was giving the valedictorian speech. On the back, she'd written, "Sometimes being scared is less important than doing what needs to be done." The money from Ricardo had allowed Darius to cut back to normal shifts, which meant he could spend more time with his mother and even take a weekend off occasionally. He used some of the extra time to volunteer with the local fire department's community safety program, teaching basic first aid and emergency response to neighborhood groups. One evening, nearly 6 months after the accident, Darius was driving home from work when he came upon another accident scene. This time, it was a fender bender, nothing serious, but an elderly man was sitting on the curb looking shaken and confused. Without thinking, Darius pulled over and got out of his car. "Are you hurt?" he asked the man. "I don't think so," the man replied. "Just rattled. I was reaching for my coffee and didn't see the light change." Darius knelt beside him and quickly assessed him for injury. The man seemed to be physically fine, just embarrassed and a bit overwhelmed by the situation. Darius stayed with him until the police arrived, helped him contact his insurance company, and made sure he had a way to get home. As he was getting back into his car, one of the police officers approached him. "Aren't you the guy from the news, the one who pulled that girl out of the burning car?" "That's me," Darius admitted. "I thought so. Good work tonight, and good work back then too. Driving home, Darius reflected on how the accident had changed his life, but perhaps not in the ways people might expect. The fame had been brief and uncomfortable, but the connections he'd made, the opportunities to help others that had emerged from it, those were lasting. He thought about Aria, probably studying for her pre-med classes at Columbia, and about how a single moment of choice had sent ripples out through multiple lives. He'd pulled her from a burning car, but in many ways, that moment had freed him too, from the financial stress that had been consuming his life, and from the narrow view he'd had of his own possibilities. His phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Ricardo, a photo of Aria in a Columbia University sweatshirt, standing in front of a chemistry lab. The message read, "She wants to specialize in emergency medicine. I wonder where she got that idea." Darius smiled and put his phone away. Tomorrow he would work his shift, take care of his patients, maybe help Mrs. Patterson with her groceries if he saw her in the hallway. Small acts, everyday kindnesses, the kind of heroism that never made the news but mattered just as much. The burning car had made him famous for a few weeks, but it was the quiet consistency of caring for others that would define his life. And somehow, that felt exactly right. A year later, Darius received another letter, this one from a young man in Detroit who had seen the news coverage of the rescue. He wrote about how the story had inspired him to become a paramedic, and how he'd just saved his first life the week before. He wanted to thank Darius for showing him that ordinary people could do extraordinary things. Darius kept the letter in his wallet, next to the photo Aria had sent him from her graduation. Reminders that sometimes the most important thing about a moment isn't what it does for you, but what it inspires in others. The accident had lasted only minutes, but its impact would continue rippling outward for years to come, touching lives Darius would never know about, inspiring acts of courage and compassion that would spawn their own stories of heroism. In the end, that was perhaps the most heroic thing of all. Not the single dramatic act, but the way that act of courage had multiplied itself, creating more heroes. More moments of choice, where people decided to run toward danger instead of away from it. When people asked him about that night, about what it felt like to be a hero, Darius always gave the same answer. He wasn't a hero, he was just a nurse who saw someone who needed help and decided to help them. But maybe, he'd begun to realize, that's what heroes actually were. Not people with special powers or unique abilities, but ordinary people who made the choice to act when action was needed. And if that was true, then heroes were everywhere, waiting for their moment to choose courage over comfort, service over safety. They were driving home from work, sitting in coffee shops, walking through parks, living quiet lives until the moment came when they were needed. The thought was both humbling and inspiring. Somewhere out there, someone was about to face their own burning car moment, their own choice between the easy path and the right path. And because of what had happened that night on Interstate 495, because of the story that had spread across news channels and social media, maybe a few more of them would make the choice to act. That was the real power of heroism, Darius had learned. Not the single moment of courage, but the way that courage spread from person to person, creating a network of people ready to help, ready to act, ready to run into the fire when someone needed saving. In his wallet, next to the letters and photos, Darius carried a small newspaper clipping. It was from a local paper, not one of the major networks or national publications that had covered the story. The headline simply read, "Local Nurse Saves Teen." Below it was a quote from him that a reporter had captured during one of the chaotic interviews in the days after the rescue. "I just hope that, if I ever need help, someone like me is nearby." Reading it now, months later, he realized that was exactly what had happened. When Aria needed help, someone like him had been nearby. Someone who had been trained to help, who had been raised to care about others, who had been placed in exactly the right spot, at exactly the right moment. And somewhere, right now, people like him were driving home from work, finishing their shifts, living their quiet lives of service and dedication. They were teachers and firefighters, social workers and store clerks, parents and students and retirees. They were everywhere, these potential heroes, waiting for their moment to matter. The thought made Darius smile as he pulled into his parking space outside his apartment building. Tomorrow he would go to work, take care of his patients, and continue living the same purposeful life he'd always lived. But now he knew something he hadn't known before that night on the highway. Heroism wasn't something rare and special that only happened to extraordinary people. It was something ordinary people did every day, in small ways and large ways, whenever they chose to help, instead of walking away. And that made the world a place where burning cars could be escaped, where teenagers could grow up to become doctors, where single moments of courage could change everything. As he walked up the stairs to his apartment, Darius could hear Mrs. Patterson struggling with her groceries again. He paused at her door and knocked gently. "Need some help with those?" he asked. "Oh, Darius, you're so kind," she said, opening the door. "But you must be tired from work." "Never too tired to help," he replied, taking the bags from her hands. And as they walked into her apartment together, he realized that this was what heroism actually looked like most of the time. Not dramatic rescues from burning cars, but simple acts of kindness between neighbors, the daily choice to care about other people, the quiet decision to help whenever help was needed. The evening news would never cover this moment. No cameras would capture it, and his phone wouldn't ring with interview requests. But Mrs. Patterson would go to bed tonight knowing someone cared about her, and tomorrow she might help someone else in turn. That was how heroism really worked. Darius understood now. Not as isolated acts of extraordinary courage, but as a continuous chain of ordinary people doing good things for each other, creating a world where help was always nearby, where someone like him was always around when you needed saving. The burning car had made the headlines, but this was the story that really mattered, the way caring multiplied itself, creating more caring, building a world where everyone was both potential hero and potential person in need of saving. And in that world, everyone was connected to everyone else, through invisible threads of compassion and service. As he said goodnight to Mrs. Patterson and headed to his own apartment, Darius felt grateful for all of it. The accident that had changed everything, the fame that had been overwhelming but brief, the connections he'd made with the Castellanos family, and most of all, the reminder that his everyday work as a nurse was itself a form of heroism, just one that happened in smaller moments, away from cameras and headlines. His phone had stopped buzzing months ago. The reporters had moved on to other stories, and his 15 minutes of fame had ended. But the real impact of that night continued in ways both seen and unseen, in Aria's pre-med studies and in the Detroit paramedics' first save. In the fire safety classes he taught, and in the simple act of helping an elderly neighbor with her groceries. That was the true story of the nurse who saved a teen from a burning car. Not the dramatic rescue that made the headlines, but the quiet ripples of inspiration and service that continued spreading outward, creating more heroes, more moments of choice, more opportunities for ordinary people to do extraordinary things for each other. And tomorrow, somewhere, someone else would face their own burning car moment. Thanks to stories like this one, maybe a few more of them would choose to run toward the fire instead of away from it. Maybe a few more heroes would be born in moments when they were needed most. That was the real power of heroism, not the single dramatic act, but the way it inspired other acts, creating an endless chain of people helping people, of ordinary individuals choosing to be extraordinary when the moment demanded it. In his apartment that night, as Darius fell asleep, he thought about all the heroes who had shaped his own life. His mother, working 2 jobs to support her family. His nursing school instructors, who had taught him to care for strangers as if they were family. His colleagues, who showed up every day to heal and comfort and serve. They had made him into someone who would run toward a burning car when he saw someone in need. And now, through the strange alchemy of media attention and human connection, he had helped create more people like himself, more individuals ready to act when action was needed. The circle was complete, but it was also just beginning. Somewhere, someone inspired by his story was choosing a career in medicine or emergency services. Somewhere, someone remembered his example and decided to help instead of walking away. Somewhere, the next hero was being born in a moment of choice between comfort and courage. And that, Darius realized as sleep took him, was the most heroic thing of all. Not just saving one person from one burning car, but helping to create a world full of people ready to save each other, one act of Arak. Courage at a time. 2 years after the accident, Darius received an unexpected phone call that would once again change the trajectory of his life. He was finishing his shift at Metropolitan General, updating patient charts, and preparing to hand over care to the night team, when his supervisor Janet approached with an unusual expression on her face. "Darius, there's someone here to see you," she said. "It's Ricardo Castellanos." Darius looked up from his computer, surprised. While he and the Castellanos family had maintained contact through occasional emails and holiday cards, Ricardo had never visited him at work. The media mogul was waiting in the small conference room near the nurse's station, looking slightly out of place in his expensive suit among the utilitarian hospital furniture. "Ricardo," Darius said, as he entered the room. "This is unexpected. Is everything okay? How's Aria?" "Aria's wonderful," Ricardo replied, standing to shake Darius's hand. "She's in her second year at Columbia now, top of her class in organic chemistry. She talks about you often, actually. Says you're the reason she found her calling." "I'm glad to hear she's doing well," Darius said, settling into a chair across from him. "What brings you here?" Ricardo's expression grew serious. "I have a proposition for you, Darius, something that might sound crazy at first, but I hope you'll hear me out." Darius waited, curious about what could have brought one of the most powerful men in media to a hospital conference room on a Tuesday evening. "I've been thinking a lot about that night," Ricardo continued. "About what you did, about the kind of person it takes to make that choice. And I've been thinking about the state of healthcare in this country, about people like your mother who struggle to get the care they need because of financial barriers." "It's definitely a problem," Darius agreed, though he wasn't sure where this conversation was heading. "I want to do something about it," Ricardo said. "I want to start a foundation, focused on emergency medical care and training. I want to create a network of rapid response teams, fund emergency medical training in underserved communities, and provide financial assistance for people who can't afford critical care." Darius felt his pulse quicken. This was exactly the kind of initiative that could make a real difference in people's lives. "That sounds incredible," he said. "How could I help?" "I want you to run it," Ricardo said simply. The words hung in the air between them. Darius felt as if the room had suddenly become very quiet, despite the usual hospital sounds continuing in the background. "I'm sorry, what? What? I want you to be the executive director of the Castellanos Emergency Care Foundation. You'd oversee all operations, design the training programs, coordinate with hospitals and emergency services, manage the financial assistance programs. You'd build it from the ground up." Darius stared at him, trying to process what he was hearing. "Ricardo, I'm a nurse. I don't know anything about running a foundation." "You know everything about the problems we're trying to solve," Ricardo replied. "You've lived them, worked in them, seen firsthand where the gaps are. You understand what people need because you've needed it yourself. And you've proven that when faced with a crisis, you act decisively and effectively. But the business side, the fundraising, the management, you can learn those things. I have people who can teach you, experts in nonprofit management and fundraising. What I can't teach is the passion and understanding you already have. I've seen a lot of people in my business, Darius. I know who has substance and who doesn't. You have substance." Darius thought about his current life at the hospital. He loved his work, loved his patients, loved the immediate impact he could have on individual lives. But he also thought about all the people who never made it to the hospital, who couldn't afford the ambulance ride or the emergency room visit, who suffered in silence because they didn't have access to care. "Can I think about it?" he asked. "Of course. Take all the time you need. But Darius, imagine what we could accomplish. Imagine how many areas we could save, how many families we could keep from going bankrupt because of medical bills, how many communities we could train to respond effectively to emergencies." That night, Darius called his mother to discuss the opportunity. Rosa Clay had always been his most trusted advisor, the person who helped him see situations clearly when his own emotions clouded his judgment. "Mijo," she said after he'd explained the offer, When you were little, you used to say you wanted to help everyone in the world. I told you that was too big a job for one person. But maybe I was wrong. What do you mean? Maybe this is how you help everyone. Not one patient at a time, but by creating something that can help many patients at many times. But I'd be giving up nursing. I love being a nurse. You'd be expanding nursing, she corrected. You'd be taking everything nursing taught you about caring for people and using it to care for more people. Over the next week, Darius found himself unable to focus on anything else. He researched foundation management, read about successful nonprofit organizations, and tried to imagine what such a foundation could accomplish. He thought about the families he'd seen in the emergency room, the ones who left against medical advice because they couldn't afford the treatment, the ones who waited until conditions became life-threatening because they couldn't afford prevention. He also thought about his colleagues, the dedicated nurses and doctors who were frustrated by their inability to help patients beyond the walls of the hospital. How many of them would jump at the chance to be part of something that addressed the root causes of health disparities? When he finally called Ricardo back, he had his answer. "I'll do it," he said, "but I have conditions." "Name them." "First, I want Aria involved. She's studying to be a doctor, and she understands the mission personally. I want her to help design the youth education components." "She'll be thrilled," Ricardo said. "What else?" "Second, I want to start small and prove the concept works before we scale up. I don't want to promise more than we can deliver." "Agreed." "Anything else?" "Third, I want transparency in everything we do. Full financial disclosure, public reporting on our outcomes, independent oversight. If we're going to do this, we do it right." "Darius, those aren't conditions. Those are the reasons I want you running this foundation." The Castellanos Emergency Care Foundation officially launched 6 months later with an initial endowment of $50 million. Darius had spent the intervening months learning about nonprofit management, studying successful foundations, and assembling a team of experts in emergency medicine, community health, and organizational development. The foundation's first initiative was a pilot program in 3 underserved neighborhoods in Queens, Brooklyn, and the Bronx. They established community emergency response training programs, created rapid response teams staffed by paramedics and nurses, and set up a fund to cover emergency medical costs for families who couldn't afford them. Darius threw himself into the work with the same intensity he'd brought to nursing. He spent his days visiting communities, meeting with local leaders, and working with medical professionals to design training programs. His evenings were filled with grant applications, budget meetings, and strategic planning sessions. The work was challenging in ways he hadn't anticipated. Running a foundation required skills he'd never needed as a nurse: public speaking, media relations, political navigation, and complex financial management. But it also drew on everything he'd learned about human nature, crisis management, and the importance of clear communication under pressure. 6 months into the pilot program, they had their first major success story. Maria Santos, a single mother in Queens, had learned CPR and basic first aid through the foundation's community training program. When her neighbor's 8-year-old son collapsed from an allergic reaction, Maria was able to administer emergency care and coordinate with the foundation's rapid response team to get him to the hospital in time to save his life. The story made local news, and suddenly the foundation was getting calls from communities across the city wanting to participate in the program. Darius found himself once again in the spotlight, but this time it felt different. Instead of being famous for a single dramatic act, he was known for building something that enabled many people to perform their own acts of heroism. Aria, now in her 3rd year of medical school, joined the foundation as a part-time program coordinator. She brought fresh perspectives on youth engagement and helped design educational materials that made emergency response training accessible to teenagers and young adults. "You know what I love about this?" she said during one of their weekly planning meetings. "We're not just saving people after emergencies happen. We're preventing emergencies from becoming tragedies." She was right. The foundation's holistic approach, combining immediate emergency response with community training and financial support, was creating a safety net that caught people before they fell through the cracks of the healthcare system. One evening, as Darius was reviewing applications for the Foundation's financial assistance program, he came across a file that made him pause. The applicant was a 62-year-old man named James Patterson, who needed cardiac surgery but couldn't afford the procedure. The name sounded familiar and went verbatim. Darius checked the address. He realized why. James Patterson was the husband of Mrs. Patterson, his elderly neighbor who he'd been helping with groceries for years. She had never mentioned that her husband was ill, had never asked for help beyond carrying her shopping bags upstairs. The next evening, Darius knocked on Mrs. Patterson's door, the approval letter for her husband's surgery in his hand. "Darius," she said, opening the door with her usual warm smile, "how lovely to see you. Would you like some coffee?" "Mrs. Patterson," he said gently, "why didn't you tell me about your husband's condition?" Her face fell, and for the first time since he'd known her, she looked every one of her 78 years. "How did you know?" she asked quietly. "You applied to my foundation for help with his surgery." "Your foundation?" She looked confused. "The Castellanos Emergency Care Foundation is yours?" "I run it," Darius explained. "And your husband's surgery is approved. We'll cover the full cost." Mrs. Patterson began to cry, and Darius found himself holding the same woman whose groceries he'd carried countless times. Now understanding that those small acts of kindness had been inadequate preparation for the much larger kindness he was now able to offer. "I didn't want to burden anyone," she whispered. "Jimmy's been sick for 2 years, but the surgery costs more than our house is worth. We were just hoping—" "You're not a burden," Darius said firmly. "This is exactly why the foundation exists." James Patterson's surgery was successful, and he made a full recovery. The story of how their neighbor had ended up saving their lives became another piece of evidence that the foundation was fulfilling its mission of creating connected communities where help was always available. As the foundation's work expanded, Darius began receiving invitations to speak at medical conferences, policy forums, and community events. He found himself becoming an advocate not just for emergency preparedness, but for a fundamental restructuring of how society thought about healthcare access and community responsibility. "Emergency medicine isn't just about ambulances and emergency rooms," he told an audience at a national healthcare summit. "It's about creating communities where emergencies are less likely to occur and more likely to be survived when they do occur." His approach was revolutionary in its simplicity. Instead of treating healthcare as something that happened in hospitals, the foundation treated it as something that happened in communities, with trained neighbors, accessible resources, and coordinated support systems. 3 years after its launch, the Castellanos Emergency Care Foundation had expanded to 12 cities and had trained over 50,000 community members in emergency response. They had covered medical costs for more than 8,000 families and had created a network of rapid response teams that had responded to over 15,000 emergency calls. But the numbers, impressive as they were, didn't capture the true impact of the work. What couldn't be quantified was the sense of security that communities felt, knowing that help was nearby. The confidence that came from being trained to handle emergencies, and the connections that formed between neighbors who were all part of the same safety net. Darius often thought about the accident that had started it all, about those few minutes on the highway that had somehow led to this much larger mission. He wondered if, on that night, he could have imagined that pulling one teenager from a burning car would eventually result in thousands of people being trained to pull others from their own burning cars, metaphorical and literal. The foundation's success had brought new challenges. Other organizations wanted to partner with them. Government agencies sought their expertise on emergency preparedness policy, and medical schools began incorporating their community-based training models into their curricula. Darius found himself at the center of a movement that was changing how America thought about emergency medicine and community health. It was gratifying work, but it was also overwhelming in ways that his nursing career had never been. One particularly stressful week, when he was dealing with a funding crisis that threatened to shut down programs in 3 cities, Darius found himself questioning whether he'd made the right choice in leaving direct patient care. He missed the immediate satisfaction of helping individual patients, the clear cause and effect relationship between his actions and their outcomes. It was Aria who helped him see the situation clearly. She was now a fourth-year medical student, planning to specialize in emergency medicine, and she had become one of his closest advisors on foundation matters. "Do you remember what you told me the night after the accident?" she asked during one of their planning meetings. "You said that most of medicine isn't dramatic rescues, it's small things. Holding someone's hand when they're scared, explaining procedures, being there for families." "I remember. What you're doing now is the same thing, just on a larger scale. You're holding the hands of entire communities, explaining how to handle emergencies, being there for thousands of families who need help. The scale is different, but the heart of it is exactly the same." She was right, and her perspective helped Darius weather the difficult periods that came with building and managing a complex organization. When funding challenges arose, he remembered that each dollar raised meant another family wouldn't face financial ruin because of a medical emergency. When political obstacles threatened programs, he thought about the communities that were counting on those programs for their safety and security. The Foundation's 5th anniversary celebration was held at the same hospital where Darius had worked as a nurse. Metropolitan General had become one of their partner institutions, and many of his former colleagues were now involved in Foundation programs. During his speech at the celebration, Darius looked out at an audience that included community members who had been trained through Foundation programs, medical professionals who had volunteered their time, and families who had been helped by Foundation services. "5 years ago," he said, "I thought heroism was about dramatic moments, about running into burning cars to save people. I've learned that real heroism is about building systems that make those dramatic moments less necessary. It's about creating communities where everyone is trained to help, where everyone has access to care, where no one faces a medical emergency alone." In the audience, he spotted Mrs. Patterson sitting next to her husband James, both of them healthy and smiling. He saw Maria Santos, the woman who had saved her neighbor's child, now a certified EMT who worked with one of the Foundation's rapid response teams. He saw Aria, radiant in her white coat, preparing to start her residency in emergency medicine. But perhaps most meaningfully, he saw faces he didn't recognize, people whose lives had been touched by the Foundation's work in ways he might never know. The teenager who had learned CPR and used it to save a classmate. The elderly man whose heart attack had been treated by a rapid response team instead of waiting for an ambulance. The family whose financial ruin had been prevented by the Foundation's assistance program. After the celebration, as Darius was cleaning up, Ricardo approached him with an expression that was both proud and emotional. "You know what I think about sometimes?" Ricardo said. "If that accident had never happened, if you hadn't been driving on that highway that night, none of this would exist. Someone else would have done something similar," Darius replied. "There are lots of people who care about these issues. But they wouldn't have done it the way you did it," Ricardo insisted. "They wouldn't have understood the problems the way you understand them. Wouldn't have built solutions that actually work for the people who need them most." That night, Darius drove home through Queens, past neighborhoods where Foundation programs operated, past communities where trained volunteers were ready to respond to emergencies, past families who slept more soundly knowing that help was available if they needed it. He thought about the nurse he had been, the one who had worked double shifts to pay his mother's medical bills, and the Foundation director he had become, the one who ensured that other families wouldn't face the same financial struggles. Both versions of himself had been dedicated to helping people, but the scale and scope of that help had expanded in ways he could never have imagined. As he parked outside his apartment building, Darius reflected on the unexpected turns his life had taken. The accident that had made him briefly famous had led to connections that changed his career, which had led to opportunities that allowed him to impact thousands of lives instead of dozens. But the core motivation remained the same, the desire to help people when they needed help most, to be the person nearby when someone's life hung in the balance, to create a world where no one faced their darkest moments alone. The Foundation was just one manifestation of that desire, but it was a powerful one. Every day, in communities across the country, people trained by Foundation programs were using their skills to help neighbors. Families were receiving medical care they couldn't afford, and emergency responders were arriving faster because of coordinated rapid response systems. The burning car had been just the beginning, the first dramatic scene in a much longer story about the multiplication of heroism, the way one act of courage could inspire and enable countless other acts of courage. Tomorrow, Darius would continue that work, building and expanding systems that made heroism possible for ordinary people in ordinary moments. He would review applications for financial assistance, visit communities to assess their emergency preparedness needs, and work with medical professionals to design new training programs. It wasn't the career he had planned when he became a nurse, but it was the career that had emerged from his commitment to caring for others. And as he fell asleep that night, Darius knew that somewhere, someone trained by his foundation was ready to run toward the next burning car, literally or figuratively, because they had been given the tools and confidence to act when action was needed. The circle of heroism continued to expand, creating more heroes, enabling more rescues, building more communities where help was always nearby. And at the center of it all was the simple truth that had driven him to action on that highway 5 years earlier. When someone needs help, you help them, regardless of the cost or risk to yourself. That principle had saved one teenager from a burning car, but it had also created a foundation that saved thousands of people from their own emergencies, large and small. The scale had changed, but the heart of it remained exactly the same. One person choosing to help another, multiplied across communities, and sustained over time until it became a movement that transformed how society cared for its most vulnerable members.